welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter, and tonight we're looking at places that were never truly abandoned, but were instead completely and deliberately covered by water. Across the United States and other parts of the world, entire towns, villages, and certain areas were completely and intentionally flooded to create reservoirs, hydroelectric lakes, and water systems. And in some cases, families were given time to relocate, but sometimes it was quite quick. Homes were dismantled, churches were moved, and communities were forced to leave behind land that had been in their families for generations. But not everything was moved. Sometimes roads or foundations of houses, and in some cases, entire cemeteries remained in place as the water rose. Graves were uncovered. Like sometimes they would move the graves. They would move the people in the graves. They were not interred, but they were removed, and then they were taken to a new burial site. But in many cases, the time, effort, and cost was just not taken into consideration, and they decided to leave those graves there. So, historical communities completely disappeared beneath the surface of these waters, these lakes. And that includes all the cultural landmarks, the gathering places, and the physical memory of entire populations that are, below the surface of the water. And what remains is not only the history of displacement, but also the stories that continue to emerge from these locations. Around many of these submerged towns, reports persist of strange lights moving across the water, voices heard on still nights, figures seen along the shorelines where no one should be, and sounds that seem to come from beneath the surface itself. Some witnesses describe hearing bells, footsteps, or the distant noise of machinery from towns that no longer exist above ground. In other places, the reports are less specific, but just as persistent, an overwhelming sense that the location is still occupied in some way, that the place beneath the water has not fully stopped living, stopped becoming stopped feeling like a space that is inhabited. It's really a strange thing to think that somebody could go stand on the edge of a lake and know that there's this town beneath the surface. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to examine the documented history of drowned towns and displaced communities, the reports of paranormal and supernatural activity that continue around them, and then the question of whether these locations hold more than just a memory. We'll look at the known historical facts, the environmental explanations, which I've done many times before, that may account for what some of these people are experiencing, and the places where those explanations may not fully account for the reports. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the submerged mining towns, flooded villages, and I'm going to end off with some controversial conversation about some weird things that are out in the world. Submerged, not necessarily intentionally submerged, but submerged nonetheless. So, the flooding of entire towns and villages is fairly common, more common than people realize. And when we talk about drowned towns, it can sound unusual, almost like it's an isolated historical curiosity. But the reality of it is that throughout the 20th century, especially during the major expansion of dam construction and hydroelectric infrastructure, this happened repeatedly across North America and around the world. Entire communities were intentionally removed from the map so that reservoirs, flood control systems, and power projects could be built. And this happened, there was a massive public works that took place during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it was happening quite a bit. So like I said, not a rare event. It was recurring, and it happened because of modernization of the United States. So one of the better examples of this is Robinette, Oregon. It was once a functioning railroad and agricultural community along the Snake River. Robinette was submerged in the 1950s during the construction of Brownlee Dam. The project was part of a broader hydroelectric effort designed to generate power and control water flow along the Snake River. Residents were forced to relocate as the waters of Brownlee Reservoir rose above the former town site. In Easonville, Alabama, the same pattern repeated. The town was flooded in the 1960s to make way for Logan Martin Lake, created by Logan Martin Dam on the Coosa River. Like many of these locations, Easonville was not simply abandoned, it was displaced by infrastructure development. So homes, roads, and parts of the community were completely lost underneath this new lake. Further west, you had Broughton, Kansas, and it was submerged during the creation of Milford Lake, a flood control and water supply reservoir to make sure that they had enough, water for the communities. The purpose here was practical and rooted in engineering concerns, so controlling river overflow and protecting surrounding regions from flooding. But the result was the same. You have a living town that became abandoned and covered by this, inundation from the lake. In Tennessee, Butler is one of the most frequently cited drowned towns. The original town was intentionally flooded in the 40s during the construction of the Watauga Dam. This one stands out because the community itself was physically relocated, with a new Butler established nearby. So even though the original town site remains beneath the waters of the Watauga Lake, during periods of low water, some of the roads and foundations can be seen. So there's basically it's like they picked it up and moved it off, and suddenly, it's this new location, but you can still see the skeleton or the remnants of the previous location beneath the water. And then there's the Lost Villages of Ontario. It's one of the most significant examples in Canada. So in the late 1950s, 10 communities along the St. Lawrence River were intentionally flooded during the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway and hydroelectric power project. So this is one of the largest engineering efforts of its kind, and it required displacement of thousands of residents. Like entire villages, roads, churches, and cemeteries were relocated or submerged to create the new waterway. Even today, the term Lost Villages remains part of local identity, which says a great deal about how deeply these places remain in cultural history. In Riffe, Washington, the town was inundated by the creation of Riffe Lake, part of the Mossy Rock Dam project. Pardon me. Like many of the others, the primary purpose of this lake creation was the hydroelectric generation and water management. Residents remained there through the transition period before the lake eventually covered the original site. And these are only a few examples. We can also look at Oscarville in Georgia, land covered by Lake Lanier, Fontaflora and Proctor in North Carolina, lost to a reservoir, Pactola in South Dakota, a mining town that's now completely beneath the Pactola Reservoir, and internationally, places like Beluga in Russia, which is submerged during the creation of the Rybinsk Reservoir. My Russian is horrible. The point here is that the fact that drowned towns are not unusual. They repeat throughout the entirety of building of infrastructure in multiple countries. So what makes these places significant really is that they still may exist physically beneath the surface, right? So the thing is that this sets the stage for some weird stuff that happens around this. This sets the stage that people are having these experiences near places that have been submerged that make no sense. So, like I said, once these towns disappeared beneath the water, their history didn't stop. They actually became a little more active, honestly. Some of the strongest paranormal claims associated with submerged communities comes from the Lost Villages in Ontario. And this may be one of the most active locations for supernatural reports among the drowned towns that I've talked about. So when the St. Lawrence Seaway project flooded 10 communities in the late 1950s, the physical towns were either relocated or submerged, like I said, but the memory of those places remained deeply rooted in the area. Today, much of that history is preserved through sites like the Lost Villages Museum in Upper Canada Village, where relocated buildings and historical structures continue to stand. Over the years, staff and visitors have reported recurring phenomena that go beyond simple local folklore. Reports include the sound of footsteps moving through empty rooms where no one else is present, objects shifting or appearing to move on their own, and shadowy figures seen in peripheral vision or crossing rooms that were confirmed to be empty. One of the most persistent stories involves the apparition of a young girl seen wandering the museum grounds and at some of the relocated buildings. Witnesses describe the sighting as brief and silent, but often disappearing when approached. Beyond the museum itself, the folklore extends to the water. Local tour groups and paranormal guides have built an entire body of storytelling around the idea that the spirits of former residents remain connected not just to the museum buildings, but to the submerged land itself. During periods of lower water, when remnants of buildings' foundations become visible, stories of unusual sensations, voices over the water, and figures seen near the shoreline tend to intensify. Whether those experiences are environmental, psychological, or something more depends or remains open, I guess, but the reports have persisted for decades. A very different kind of folklore developed around Butler, Tennessee. The original town now lies, like I said, beneath Watauga Lake. And some of the stories here are less traditional ghost narratives and more in the realm of regional legend and supernatural folklore. One of the strangest is a long-running local tale that the town was not simply flooded for hydroelectric power, but to eliminate something far more dangerous, a supposed vampire infestation. According to the legend, something was terrorizing the town, and the flooding of the valley was the only way to contain it. The story goes on to claim that if the lake were ever to be drained for too long, whatever was trapped beneath the water would return. So, this vampire population would rise again if they were able to cross the water. Obviously, there's no historical evidence supporting this claim, but it clearly falls into the category of folklore rather than documented events. However, this story persists, and that says something important about how these submerged towns become fertile grounds for supernatural interpretation. There's a second story tied to Butler, and it's much more in line with classic haunting folklore. Local tradition speaks of a man known as Mambo, often described as the town drunk, who allegedly drowned when the gates were closed during the flooding of the original town. So he was behind these gates. The gates were locked. Maybe he was sleeping it off, and when the flooding took place, he was stuck there. So since then, these locals claim that his spirit remains tied to the lake, and the stories and sightings of him continue to circulate. Now, in Riffe, Washington, where the paranormal claims are tied less to the original town and more to the structure that erased it. So the creation of Riffe Lake happened during the construction of the Mossy Rock Dam, which came with its own tragedies. Local historian accounts say that 5 workers died during the construction of the dam. And over time, stories emerged of unexplained sounds near the site, particularly around the anniversary period in September. Visitors have reported hearing loud splashes, sounds described as something large or heavy hitting the water. Even when no one is present, no visible cause can be found. Now, that could be a giant catfish. I know we have those in several of the lakes and dams around Texas. They can get up to 6-7 feet long, 300 pounds. So that's a possibility of that noise. But I don't want to discard someone's experience. I just want to say that that's a possibility. When the water levels drop there at Lake Riffe, the remains of the actual village can become visible. The exposed foundations and strange stump-like remnants left behind in the lake have been widely described as unsettling. Many visitors and local reports refer to the site as eerie or haunting, and not necessarily because of a specific ghost story, but because the visual impact of seeing a town's remains emerge from the water is pretty spectacular and, I would say, uncanny. Sometimes the paranormal reputation of a place begins not with an apparition, but with the undeniable physical reminder that an entire community still exists beneath the surface. And that's where many of these stories sort of take hold. Now, there's other areas, not just those that I talked about, but there's some other ones as well. So when you start looking at drowned towns across North America, a pattern starts to emerge. The history may differ from place to place, but the reports often sound very similar. One of the most frequently discussed examples is Lake Lanier in Georgia, where the former community of Oscarville now lies beneath the surface. And this is one of the most widely known submerged town haunting narratives in the United States. The lake was created in the 1950s and flooded the land to Oscarville and other communities. Since then, the site's developed a persistent reputation for paranormal activity, and of course, one of those is the famous story of the Lady of the Lake, and she is reportedly seen near the shoreline and around the bridge area. She's often described as a woman in a blue dress, which is unusual because typically when ghost hauntings happen, it's typically a lady in white or a lady in gray, but here we have a blue dress. And local folklore also includes repeated accounts of swimmers and boaters who describe the sensation of something pulling at their legs or dragging them downward. There is obviously submerged debris, and hazardous underwater conditions can clearly contribute to the fact that people think that they're being pulled under, but it's kept this supernatural reputation because of that. In western North Carolina, Proctor and Judson were both submerged by the creation of Fontana Lake. And they have their own long-standing reputation for strange occurrences. So Proctor is particularly interesting because portions of the original town and its cemeteries remain accessible only by trail and ferry. That continued connection to burial grounds and former home sites has helped preserve a strong sense of local haunting folklore. So one of the accounts tied to the area even references a hiker reporting paranormal activity while passing through the remains of the former town. So it's interesting there because not only these simply abstract legends, these families still return to visit the old cemeteries, which means that the memory of the town remains active and in the present. That often strengthens reports of unusual feelings, unexplained sounds, and sightings in the area around the lake. Another location worth including is Fonta Flora, and this is in North Carolina. While its historical details are sometimes blended with local folklore, the site itself has become part of a regional ghost story tradition. Even the historical record notes that after its flooding, the village entered local folklore, that it's often how these stories begin, not necessarily with a specific apparition, but with a place that becomes understood as spiritually active after being submerged. Beyond North America, similar narratives appear in other submerged towns worldwide. So when the ruins emerge during drought or low water, stories often intensify. People describe seeing figures near exposed foundations, hearing voices, or experiencing a strong sense of presence. So like I said, one town has a woman in blue, another has footsteps at a museum. The thing is, we have to try to look at the reasons why these accounts persist, right? So why do so many of these locations continue to generate these reports of strange activities? Why do people consistently describe similar experiences across all of these different areas? So the first place to start is with the human history of these locations. In some cases, the land itself provided a tragedy. And a strong example of this is Lake Lanier in the former town of Oscarville, right? Before the reservoir was created in the 1950s, the area had already been marked by profound violence and displacement. In 1912, the black residents of Oscarville and much of Forsyth County were forcibly expelled through racial terror, arson, intimidation, and mob violence. More than 1,000 people were driven from their homes. Decades later, much of that land was acquired and flooded to create Lake Lanier. So this is important because paranormal reports surrounding the lake are often often interpreted through that history. So even without moving into this supernatural claims, the places marked by collective trauma often retain powerful cultural memory. So if you have a cultural memory of something violent or aggressive taking place in that area, you're constantly going to be thinking that there is violence or aggressive energies in that space. So when repeated witness accounts continue for decades, apparitions near the shoreline, sensations of being pulled underwater, and reoccurring stories of figures seen where former roads and homes once stood, many people begin to ask whether the story of the land itself plays a role. So another factor is that some of these submerged towns, people actually died during the flooding of the village. One of these is in Watauga, Russia. When the Riffe reservoir was created, around 130,000 people were displaced, but historical accounts state that 294 residents refused to leave and ultimately drowned as the waters rose. A monument now commemorates those who stayed behind. This is one of the most significant cases because it moves beyond folklore. This is a documented human loss directly associated with the inundation. When places become associated with known deaths, especially deaths tied to a refusal to abandon their home, paranormal narratives tend to intensify. People began asking whether the spirits of those who remained are still tied to the place. So that doesn't prove anything supernatural, but it does explain why these locations become focal points for ghost stories and reoccurring reports. And there's some interesting things about, people may ask, well, there's this paranormal stuff. Are these sites aligned with ley lines, geomagnetic corridors, or what people in the conspiracy world like to call the 37th parallel phenomenon? Now, ley lines themselves are not accepted scientific framework. They belong more to earth energy and paranormal people's interpretation as opposed to geology. That said, they remain a major part of paranormal interpretation. So the 37th parallel in particular has been discussed for decades as a corridor associated with high strangeness, UFO sightings, cryptid reports, and other anomalous events. This becomes interesting when you begin mapping some submerged towns and reservoirs near that broader latitude band, especially across states like Kansas, Missouri, Tennessee, and North Carolina. It doesn't create a definitive connection, but it does create another layer of interpretation for people who are already following high strangeness geography. So, and I will do an episode on the 37th parallel. I think it's really interesting. So there is a possibility that there is geomagnetic and environmental effects, and I've talked about how large body of waters changes acoustics and temperature inversions can create mechanical sounds or distant noises, and put them, send them further than you would imagine. So like a door closing on opposite side of the lake may be due to the environmental factor, and the temperature inversion sent all the way across the lake, and it sounds like it's really close. There's also light reflecting off the water and low mist, which can create these weird visual anomalies. So I've talked about that before. But some people will think that perhaps this is just a residual haunting, and it's not an intelligent spirit, but it's just an intense human activity, a trauma due to displacement and death that leaves some sort of spiritual or energetic imprint on a space. And, I think if you look at science, you can't destroy, you can't destroy energy or matter. Like, it can only be changed. So a solid can turn to a gas, or a gas can turn to a liquid. So maybe your spirit is a ball of energy, and that energy does not go away. Perhaps it gets displaced from the material world. And, we can look at religious traditions and all that other stuff, and talks about our spiritual journey. That could just be the energy of our body transferring into this energetic space. But it could be sort of captured in the environment as well. All right, so if we think about that, then we can think about this concept called the stone tape theory. Now, this concept is where certain environments may retain an imprint of events that occurred there, so particularly events marked by strong emotional energy, repeated human activity, trauma, or death. And basically what it's saying is that certain rocks can be used kind of like a magnetic tape that records and reflects things back. There's also the concept of the water being a recording, like a natural recording medium. So this isn't in the literal technological sense, but as an environmental substance capable of carrying vibrational or energetic information. So if you think about how those things work together, we know that crystal has energy, that it can store energy. We know that certain rocks, granite, limestone, those sorts of rocks can actually hold and carry an energy, and also the water can carry energy, and sometimes those three things together can create a more powerful recording device, right? So, pardon me. Now, I want to switch over really quickly. So, the idea that these paranormal events happen around these places makes perfect sense to me. I'll go into a little bit why here in a second, but for me it just makes perfect sense that the loss of life, the tragedy, the displacement, cultural memory can create this sort of energy that's stored, and perhaps through the process of this magnetic tape in stone, or this carrier of energy through water, can, in some people, enhance their ability to see more, to unlock their extrasensory perception, because they're being provided additional energy or information that they don't normally have access to. So that's sort of my thought process there. Now, I want to talk about some weird things that I was talking about before. It's not necessarily submerged on purpose, but there's some really interesting places that are submerged, and they seem out of place. For instance, one of the most debated examples is the Cuban underwater formation off of Guanajacaribes Peninsula. So in 2001, marine engineer Paulina Zaletsky and her team were conducting sonar surveys off the western coast of Cuba when they identified what appeared to be large geometric structures on the seafloor. The site was mapped across roughly 2 square miles at the depths between 600 and 750 meters, so basically 2,000 feet below sea level. The sonar images reportedly showed large smooth blocks, some with pyramid-like or circular shapes, arranged in a way that some observers interpreted as roadways or urban layout. So, at that depth, conventional archaeology and geology raise immediate questions. For a site to be submerged that deeply and still have once been above sea level, the timeline becomes extreme. So, Cuban geologist Manuel Etarade noted that the depth could imply tens of thousands of years of geological change, far earlier than any accepted urban civilization at that region. That creates two possible lines of thought. The first is the mainstream example or explanation. These are natural geological formations, and the human mind is imposing structure and meaning onto sonar imagery. So that's a legitimate possibility. Symmetry can occur naturally. Rocks can fragment, and tectonic movement and underwater erosion can make some really interesting geometric shapes. But the second line of thought is what keeps this anomaly alive. If the formations are not entirely natural, then they imply something historically inconsistent with our current timeline. Not necessarily Atlantis in the popular sense, but the possibility that there are chapters of human or pre-human settlement that remain hidden, incomplete, or simply missing from the record, the accepted record. This is why the Cuban anomaly often gets discussed alongside other underwater historical mysteries. There's the Yanagui Monument off of Japan is one such example, where underwater formations have been interpreted as either natural stepped sandstone or remains of worked structures. There's also the Bimini Road in the Bahamas that carries a similar split in interpretation. One group of thought says that it's a beach rock formation, and the others say it's the evidence of a lost civilization because it's a roadway. So there's all of these different areas. Doggerland in the North Sea, Dwarka in India, Port Royal in Jamaica. There's loads of these different buildings that are underneath the sea. So what I want to say is I think when you step back and look at all these reports together, I think the most reasonable conclusion is that there may not be a single explanation. Some of what people experience at these submerged locations may be explained by environmental factors like water changing the acoustic and carrying sound. At the same time, I do think that there's room for an idea that some locations may function in a way similar to the stone tape theory. Places that are marked by trauma, displaced repeated human activity, and death may retain some sort of residual imprint. So whether that imprint is psychological, environmental, or something genuinely paranormal is obviously still open to debate. And then there's another possibility. So some environments may heighten perception in just certain individuals. So if water, geology, and geomagnetic conditions interact in ways that we don't fully understand, it's possible that certain people are more sensitive to those conditions. What some would call extrasensory perception may in some cases just be an enhanced awareness of environmental signals that others don't consciously notice. And if that's true, then submerged towns, drowned villages, and underwater anomalies may be uniquely situated to produce these experiences. And it's not because every single report's supernatural, but because these locations sit at the intersection of history, environment, memory, and the unknown. This is why I think the stories continue, because whether it's the stone tape, acoustics, heightened perception, or something beyond current understanding, these places continue to affect people long after they've disappeared beneath the surface. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you do, please like, subscribe, tell your friends. Let's get this thing going so I can make this my full-time job. I look forward to presenting to you with new things each week, and thank you so much for your continued support.